The letter arrived in Kansas City on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, folded twice over and sealed with a smudge of red wax that had clearly been pressed with a thumb rather than any proper stamp, and Evelyn Hale read it 3 times before she believed it was real. She was 24 years old, standing in the narrow hallway of her aunt's boarding house with the morning light coming through the window at the end of the corridor, and the letter shook slightly in her hands, not from nerves, she told herself, but from the draft that came under the door. She had answered the advertisement in the Kansas City Journal 6 weeks prior, responding to a notice that had been brief and a little odd and strangely honest. Rancher in Coldwater Creek, Colorado Territory, seeks capable woman of good character for purposes of keeping house, managing accounts, and general partnership in the running of a cattle operation. References appreciated but not required. Salary negotiable. Situation somewhat complicated. Somewhat complicated. She had laughed out loud when she read those words, sitting at her aunt's kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her. Every situation she had ever been in had been somewhat complicated, and she figured she was well equipped for another one. She had written back the same day, describing herself with careful honesty. She was educated, having attended 2 years of normal school before her father's illness had pulled her back to Kansas City. She was not afraid of hard work, having spent the last 3 years bookkeeping for her uncle's hardware store. She was not married and did not intend to be unless she found good reason for it, and she could ride a horse passably well, though she made no claim to expertise in that particular area. She had sealed the letter and posted it without much expectation of a reply, because the truth was she had answered 4 such advertisements in the past year, and none of them had gone anywhere useful. This reply, though, this one was different from the start. Timothy Collier had written back in a hand that was clear and deliberate, each letter formed with a kind of careful effort that suggested he did not write often but took it seriously when he did. He confirmed that he owned a cattle ranch called the Running Creek Spread, approximately 4,000 acres southeast of the town of Coldwater Creek, Colorado Territory. He confirmed that he needed someone capable of managing the accounts, which had fallen into a state he described as creative disarray, and of keeping the household in some sort of reasonable order. He had 2 ranch hands, brothers named Walt and Silas Drum, who were reliable but would require feeding. He himself was 31 years old and had come to the territory 7 years prior from Virginia, which had not been a gentle place to leave, but had been impossible to stay in after the war and everything that followed. The land, he wrote, was difficult and beautiful, and he was glad of it most days. Then came the part that made Evelyn read it twice more. He wrote, "I am aware that this advertisement, and indeed this entire arrangement, is highly unconventional, and I want to be honest with you about the full nature of what I am proposing. I need someone capable and trustworthy, and I believe you are both from your letter. I have not considered myself in a position to think about anything beyond practicality for quite some time. If you are willing to come to Coldwater Creek and manage the ranch affairs, I will pay you fairly and guarantee your safety and comfort. I confess that I am writing this letter faster than I am thinking it through, and I suspect by the time you might read it I will have a clearer sense of what I am truly asking. Whatever that turns out to be, I mean to be square with you about it. If you are willing to come, please write back and I will arrange for your passage." Evelyn set the letter down on the narrow hall table and looked at herself in the small mirror that hung there. Her dark hair was pinned up but coming loose on one side, and her gray eyes were the kind of eyes that people sometimes said looked older than the rest of her face, serious eyes. Her aunt had always called them, eyes that had been thinking about something difficult since she was about 12. She looked at herself for a long moment. Then she went to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and wrote back to say she would come. She did not tell her aunt the full contents of the letter. She told her that she had found a housekeeping position in the Colorado Territory at a cattle ranch, and that it paid a reasonable wage, and that she thought the change of scenery would do her good. Her aunt, who was a practical woman, and knew that Evelyn could not stay in that boarding house forever without something useful to occupy her considerable mind, kissed her on the forehead and began helping her pack. The journey from Kansas City to Colorado Territory in 1878 was not brief, and it was not gentle. Evelyn took the Kansas Pacific Railroad westward to Pueblo, which was a journey of 2 days and 2 nights that involved a great deal of coal smoke and the sound of the baby 3 seats ahead of her crying at intervals throughout both nights. From Pueblo, she had to arrange for a stagecoach northward into the mountains, a journey that took the better part of another day and a half over roads that she would have described charitably as ambitious, and less charitably as a determined effort to shake the passengers apart and see what fell out. The Colorado Territory in late April was something she was not prepared for. The sky was enormous, the kind of sky that made a person feel both very small and somehow enlarged at the same time, and the mountains to the west were still carrying snow on their peaks like they were not in any particular hurry to give it up. She arrived in Coldwater Creek on a Thursday afternoon with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, a small parcel of books that she had refused to leave behind, and a feeling in her chest that she identified as something between excitement and the sort of calm that comes right before a very important thing happens. Coldwater Creek was a small town, the kind of town that was still deciding whether it was going to become something permanent or whether it would fold back into the earth once the cattle boom moved on. There was a main street with a general store, a livery stable, a hotel of the single-room-per-floor variety, a saloon called the Meridian, a post office that doubled as a telegraph office, and a small whitewashed church at the far end that looked like it had been placed there by someone with strong opinions about where things ought to go. The mountains were visible from every direction, and the air was so clear that it made Kansas City feel like she had been breathing through a wet cloth for the past 3 years. She stepped down from the stagecoach with as much dignity as a woman could manage after a day and a half of being rattled along a mountain road, and she stood on the main street of Coldwater Creek with her trunk stacked beside her and looked around. That was when she saw him. He was standing on the other side of the street, leaning against the post of the general store with his hat pulled down slightly against the afternoon sun, and he was watching the stagecoach with an expression that she could not quite read from this distance, but that she recognized as the look of someone who had been waiting and was now facing the reality of whatever they had been waiting for. He was tall, lean in the way that men who work outdoors get lean, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in a few days. He was wearing a plain work shirt and canvas trousers and boots that were good boots but had been well used, and there was something in the way he was standing not exactly still, but contained, like a man holding a quiet thought, that made Evelyn study him for a moment before the stagecoach driver handed down her carpet bag and broke her attention. When she looked up again, the man had crossed the street and was standing a polite distance from her, turning his hat in his hands in a way that she would later come to understand was what he did when he was uncertain about something. "Miss Hale," he said. His voice was low and a little careful, and carried the faint remnant of a Virginia accent that had been worn down by years of the West. "Mr. Collier," she said, and held out her hand. He shook it, looking at her directly, and she saw that his eyes were a dark, quiet brown that had the same quality as the mountains behind him, something ancient and weathered and still in them. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has surprised him without quite knowing what it means yet. "You made good time," he said. "The railroad was efficient," she said. "The road from Pueblo was considerably less so." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one forming. "I should have warned you about that road. I forgot that people who haven't come up it before tend to find it notable." "That is one word for it," she said. "I have several others, but I will save them for a better acquainted moment." This time the smile arrived fully, and it changed his face in a way that Evelyn noted and then deliberately set aside for later consideration. He helped her with her trunks, loading them into a wagon that was hitched to two horses in front of the livery stable's sturdy animals, a bay and a roan, well kept. He moved with economy and purpose, not wasting effort, and she appreciated that in a person. They set off from Coldwater Creek on a road that headed southeast, into the wide open land that lay between the town and the mountains, and the afternoon light was turning the color of warm honey over everything as they went. For the first several minutes they rode in silence, and it was not an uncomfortable silence, which she noticed. She was not a woman who felt the need to fill every pause with words, and apparently neither was he. "I want to apologize," he said eventually, his eyes on the road ahead. "For what specifically?" she asked. "My letter," he said. "I reread it after I sent it and I realized it must have sounded peculiar, the part at the end especially. The part where you said you were writing faster than you were thinking." "Yes," he said, and there was an honesty in his voice that she found unexpectedly disarming. "I meant to say something practical and straightforward, and instead it came out like something else." Evelyn considered this. The land was opening up around them, the wide Colorado plain stretching out with the mountains at its back and the sky pressing down enormous and luminous overhead. In the distance she could see the dark smudge of cattle moving slowly, and beyond them the low shapes of buildings. "I thought it was the most honest letter I had ever received from someone I had never met," she said. He glanced at her then quickly, and then back at the road. "I'm not sure that's a compliment to the letter so much as it is an indictment of most letters." "Take it as both," she said. They reached the ranch just as the sun was getting close to the mountains. The running creek spread was not grand, but it was substantial and well-maintained, a main house built of good lumber with a covered porch that ran the full width of the front, a large barn, a bunkhouse to one side, and beyond them the corrals where horses moved in the late light. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, which gave the ranch its name, and the sound of it was audible even from the yard, that constant low conversation of moving water that she would later discover she could hear from her bedroom window on still nights. Two men emerged from the barn as they pulled into the yard, the Drum brothers, Walt and Silas. Walt was the elder, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a broad-shouldered, dependable look about him and a genuine smile when he tipped his hat to her. Silas was maybe 26, rangy and freckled, and wearing an expression of unguarded curiosity that suggested he had not entirely made up his mind about what to make of her arrival. She liked him for it. "Miss Hale," Walt said, "it's real good to have you here. Timmy's been in a state about those accounts for 2 months. "Walt," Timothy said, in a tone that managed to be mild and pointed at the same time. "It's the truth," Walt said cheerfully and helped with the trunks. The inside of the house was clean, which surprised her, and she realized she should not have been surprised by it, because Timothy Collier did not strike her as a man who lived in disorder despite the state of his accounts. The main room had a large stone fireplace, a table long enough for 6, chairs that had been placed with some thought to comfort rather than just arrangement, and a shelf of books along one wall that immediately drew her eye. The kitchen was workable and well-stocked, and the room she was shown, a corner room at the back of the house with 2 windows, one facing the mountains and one facing the creek, was simple and clean, and had a quilt on the bed that had clearly been made by someone who knew what they were doing with a needle. "This was good of you," she said, touching the edge of the quilt. "My mother made it," Timothy said from the doorway. He said it simply, with no additional explanation, and she understood from his tone that she should not require one. "She did fine work," Evelyn said. "She did," he agreed. He left her to settle in, and she stood at the window that faced the creek and listened to the sound of it in the early evening quiet and thought that whatever this situation was, she was glad she had come. The first week was work, plain and pure and absorbing. The accounts were, as Timothy had described, in a state of creative disarray. which she discovered meant that there was a system. But it was a system that had evolved organically over several years and existed primarily in Timothy's head rather than on paper, which made it simultaneously comprehensive and completely impractical for anyone besides him to navigate. She sat at the table with 3 years of ledger books, receipts, bills of sale, and what appeared to be a collection of notes written on whatever had been to hand at the time, including the back of a flour sack and the margin of an old almanac. And she organized them into order with the methodical focus that had always been her particular gift. Timothy brought her coffee in the mornings without being asked, and this small habit established itself so naturally that she barely noticed it becoming a pattern until about the 4th morning, when she looked up to find him setting the cup beside her work and looked at him for a moment and thought about the pattern. He noticed her noticing. "Habit," he said simply. "A good one," she said, and went back to the ledger. She had a quick mind for numbers and a quicker mind for patterns, and by the end of the first week she had identified that the ranch was in reasonable financial health, but had been losing money on the eastern pasture lease that Timothy had been paying for 3 years on the assumption that the grass was worth more than it was. She brought this to him on a Friday evening when the Drum brothers had gone to town, and the ranch was quiet, spreading the relevant papers across the table and explaining her reasoning. He listened without interrupting, which she appreciated, leaning forward with his elbows on the table and his eyes on the figures, and when she finished he sat back and rubbed the side of his jaw and said, "I knew that pasture didn't feel right." "Your instinct was correct," she said. "Your mathematics were less so. I'm better with cattle than with figures. That's why you needed me," she said. He looked at her then in a way that was slightly different from the way he had been looking at the papers, and there was something in it that she felt in her chest, quick and warm, and she looked back at the papers because it was easier. "It is," he said quietly. "Among other reasons, I'm still working out." She let that sit there between them without touching it, because she was not ready to touch it yet, and she suspected he wasn't entirely either. What she was learning about Timothy Collier during those first weeks was an accumulating series of careful observations that she began to structure in her mind the way she structured a ledger column by column, entry by entry, building toward a total she could not yet calculate. He rose before the sun every morning without any apparent effort, as though his body simply knew what the land needed and organized itself accordingly. He treated the Drum brothers with an easy, genuine respect that was not the condescension of a man tolerating his workers, but the regard of a man who understood that the people around him were the mechanism by which anything got done, and he had the good sense to know it. He read in the evenings serious books, she noted, a worn copy of Thoreau and a history of the Roman Republic that had clearly been read more than once, and occasionally, somewhat to her surprise, poetry. She discovered the poetry by accident on the second Tuesday, when she went to the sitting room to retrieve a pencil she had left there and found him at the fireplace with a slim volume that he closed and set aside with the speed of a man caught at something private. She said nothing about it. But the next morning when he brought her coffee, she said, without preamble, "Longfellow or someone else." He paused in the doorway. "Whitman," he said after a moment. "Good choice," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "You've read Whitman." "I've read a great deal," she said. "Normal school and then 3 years of Uncle's hardware store, which leaves considerable evening time if you're not inclined toward whist." "I'm not inclined toward whist either," he said. "Then we have that in common," she said, and added one more entry to her mental ledger. The town of Coldwater Creek was, she was discovering, a community in the specific and complicated way that frontier towns were communities, held together by necessity and proximity, and the shared understanding that in a place as large and demanding as the Colorado Territory, people needed each other whether they particularly liked each other or not. She had gone into town with Walt on her second week to collect supplies, and had been introduced to a collection of personalities that ranged from genuinely warm to cautiously assessing. The woman who ran the general store was named Ruth Beaumont, a wide, capable woman in her 40s who had come from Missouri 10 years ago with her husband and stayed after he died because, as she put it, she had put too much work into the garden to leave it for someone else. Ruth had given Evelyn a long, measuring look, and then apparently decided she approved, because she had immediately launched into a detailed account of the town's social and practical operations. That was the most useful thing anyone had told Evelyn since her arrival. "People here are decent on the whole," Ruth had told her, sorting flour into bags with a speed that suggested she could do it blindfolded. "We've got the usual trouble with weather and cattle prices and the occasional disagreement that gets louder than it ought to in the Meridian, but nothing serious for a while now. The Collier Ranch is a solid operation. Timothy is a solid man." "I've gathered that," Evelyn said. "He hasn't had an easy go of it," Ruth said, in a tone that communicated both that there was more to say and that she was going to choose her words carefully. "Came out here with almost nothing after the war and built that place from the ground up. Lost his partner in the 3rd year, his best friend, cattle sickness. Keeps to himself more than he ought to, maybe." "I imagine he has his reasons," Evelyn said. "Everybody does," Ruth said. "Doesn't always mean they're the right ones." There was a man in town named Chester Vane who owned a neighboring spread and who had, Ruth mentioned casually, made an offer on the eastern pasture lease twice in the past 2 years that Timothy had declined. Evelyn filed this information away without comment, though she thought about it later when she was reviewing the leases and began to understand that the eastern pasture, unprofitable as it currently was, might be worth more in the future than it was worth now if the water rights that came with it were properly mapped and documented. She brought this to Timothy 3 weeks into her time at the ranch, on an evening when they were sitting on the front porch after supper. Something that had also established itself as a quiet habit, the after-supper hour on the porch where the mountains caught the last light and the first stars came out over the plains. "Chester Vane has offered you money for that eastern lease twice," she said. Timothy was quiet for a moment. "Ruth told you." "Ruth is a comprehensive source of information," Evelyn said. "Why did you decline?" "Because Chester Vane wanting something has generally been a good indicator that there is more to it than what he wants you to think," Timothy said, and there was a flatness in his voice that she recognized as experience rather than simple dislike. "The water rights," she said. He looked at her. "You found that?" "I found the original survey maps in the bottom of the ledger box. The creek cuts through a section of that eastern pasture. If it's properly documented and the water rights are registered, the value of that parcel goes up considerably." She watched his profile against the darkening sky. Someone who understands the territory's water law would know that. "Chester Vane's brother is a land agent in Denver," Timothy said. "Then yes," she said. "He knows it." Timothy was quiet for a long moment, his elbows on his knees, looking out across the darkening yard to where the creek sound was coming faintly from the east. Then he said, "I sent you that letter and asked you to come and manage the accounts. I don't think I understood what I was asking." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I thought I needed bookkeeping," he said. He turned his head and looked at her, and in the low evening light his expression was completely open in a way she had not seen before, every guard he habitually kept around himself simply absent, and it struck her with unexpected force. "I'm starting to think I needed something else entirely, and I didn't have the language for it when I wrote the letter." "Timothy," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying it right." He looked away again, turned his hat in his hands. That gesture she had already learned meant he was uncertain. "I built this place for something, and I never quite finished deciding what for. It was easier not to decide. And then I wrote that advertisement and your letter came and I figured at worst it was practical and at best." He stopped. "At best," she said. He looked back at her. The first star had come out over the mountains. "I didn't know how to finish that sentence when I wrote the letter," he said. "I'm starting to." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Her heart was doing something specific and unauthorized in her chest. She said, "I came here because the advertisement was honest and the reply was honest, and I decided that honesty was worth following." "Is it?" he asked. "Still, I mean, now that you're here." "I think so," she said. "I think more so." He nodded slowly, and something in his expression settled, the way a thing settles when it has been uncertain and has found a direction. He did not reach for her hand or say anything more, and she was glad of it, because she was not ready for either thing yet, and she thought he understood that, and the fact that he understood it was itself another entry in her ledger. She was good at patience. She had learned it the hard way, waiting by her father's sickbed for a year and a half while he slowly failed, and then making herself useful in the hardware store while the question of what she wanted from her own life sat in the back of her mind like a slow-burning fire. She knew how to let things move at the pace they needed to move without forcing them. What she had not expected was for it to be difficult. She had not expected to find herself aware of him at the breakfast table in a way that was not purely practical. She had not expected to be glad when he appeared in the kitchen doorway in the mornings, and faintly disappointed when he went out to the yard, and she could no longer hear his voice talking to the horses. She had not expected to reread parts of his letter with a new understanding of what he had been trying to say in it, or to feel something warm and complicated when she did. The situation with Chester Vane gave her something practical to focus on, which was useful. 3 weeks after her conversation with Timothy about the water rights, she went into Coldwater Creek on a Wednesday with a specific purpose. She had written, with Timothy's knowledge and permission, to the Territorial Land Office in Denver, requesting copies of the relevant survey records and inquiring about the process for registering water rights on the creek section. She had also written to a land attorney in Pueblo, whose name she had found in the back of one of the older legal documents in the ledger box. At the post office, she collected the responses. The Territorial Land Office had confirmed that the water rights in question were currently unregistered, which meant they were legally unprotected, and had enclosed the relevant forms for registration. The attorney in Pueblo had written a careful and useful letter about the process. She was coming out of the post office when she nearly collided with a man she had not met before, tall, with a prosperous look that was specific to a certain kind of frontier businessman, gray at the temples, wearing a good coat that was slightly too good for a working day. "You must be the woman from the Collier ranch," he said, with a smile that was sociable but had calculation behind it. "Chester Vane. I run the Vane operation east of here." "Evelyn Hale," she said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Vane. I hope you're settling in well," he said, and his eyes moved briefly to the papers she was carrying. "Timothy keeping you busy?" "Very much so," she said pleasantly. "The accounts were in need of some attention." "I imagine," he said. "Timothy is a good rancher, but he's never had much head for the business side of things. If he ever needs advice on the practical matters, the land issues in particular, I'm always available." "That's kind of you," she said, holding his gaze without any particular expression. "I think we have things well in hand." There was a flicker of something in his eyes' reassessment that told her he was smarter than he wanted to appear, which meant he was also more careful to deal with. "Well," he said, "if there's anything I can do, you know where to find me." She said something gracious and walked back to the wagon, and when she got there, she sat for a moment before picking up the reins and thought very carefully about Chester Vane and what he would do when he realized the water rights were going to be properly registered. She told Timothy about it that evening, not sparing any detail, and he listened with that focused, complete attention that she appreciated in him. He always listened as though what she was saying was the only thing in the room worth attending to. When she finished, he said, "He'll try to make a deal before the registration goes through." "I think so," she said, "and if not a deal, something less pleasant." "He's never been a man who reacts well to not getting what he wants," Timothy said. "But he's also not stupid. He won't do anything that crosses a legal line he can't step back from." He looked at the registration forms on the table. "How soon can we file these?" "I need to take them to the land office in Pueblo," she said. I can take the stage next week. He looked at her. I'll take you, he said. I've been meaning to go to Pueblo anyway. You don't have to, I know, he said. She met his eyes. All right, she said. The trip to Pueblo took 2 days each way, and they traveled it in the wagon because it was easier than the stage, and Timothy knew the roads well enough to make reasonable time without the dramatic rattling that had characterized her initial arrival. They stayed in Pueblo for a single night at a decent hotel, 2 rooms, no ambiguity, and filed the water rights registration at the land office the following morning, where a clerk in a green eyeshade looked over their papers and said that it all appeared in order and the registration would be processed and returned within 6 weeks. On the road back somewhere in the afternoon of the second day, with the mountains ahead of them and the light going long and amber over the plains, Timothy said, "Tell me about Kansas City." She looked at him. "What specifically?" "Whatever you want to tell me," he said. She thought about it. "My father was a school teacher," she said. He was a careful, thoughtful man who loved books and coffee and long conversations about ideas, and he died of consumption when I was 21, slowly and with great patience, which was characteristic of him. My mother died when I was 7. I lived with my aunt and uncle after my father's death because I had nowhere else that was practical to go, and I kept books for my uncle's hardware store because I was good at it and it was useful, and I told myself that was enough for 3 years. "But it wasn't," he said. "No," she said. "It was good, honest work and I was grateful for it, but it was not enough. She paused. I wanted a life that felt like mine." "That sounds selfish, perhaps." "It doesn't," he said quietly. "What about Virginia?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, the horses moving steadily under the wide sky. "My father owned land," he said. "Not a great deal, but enough that it mattered to us. The war went through everything and took most of it, and what it didn't take the Reconstruction years made complicated in ways I didn't have the patience for. I had a friend named Daniel Marsh who was from Illinois, and he talked about the West the way some people talk about heaven, like it was a place where a man could build something that was actually his, on ground that didn't have anyone else's history baked into it." He paused. "We came out together in 71. Daniel died in 74. Cattle sickness, like Ruth probably told you because Ruth knows everything." "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. "He sounds like someone worth keeping." "He was the best man I knew," Timothy said simply. "And after he died I figured the only thing to do was keep building what we'd started together because stopping would have felt like abandoning something. So I kept going." He looked ahead at the mountains. "I've kept going for 4 years on my own and I've done all right, but I started to feel like I was building a house that nobody was going to live in." Evelyn did not say anything immediately. The wagon moved on. A hawk was circling high overhead, riding the thermals in wide, patient loops. "That's what the letter was," she said finally, "when you said you'd figure out what you were asking by the time I arrived." "I figured it out before you arrived, actually," he said. "About 3 weeks after I sent the letter. I stood in that main room one evening and looked at the shelf of books and thought about a woman I had never met who had apparently read Whitman, and I understood what I had been trying to say. Her heart was doing that specific, unauthorized thing again. And what were you trying to say?" He turned to look at her, and the afternoon light was full on his face and she saw everything in it, the careful, weathered honesty of a man who had been alone too long and had finally located the word for what was missing. "I was trying to say I didn't want to do this alone anymore," he said. "I just didn't have the right to say it that plainly to someone I had never met." "You could have," she said. "I would have understood it." "Would you have come?" She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. "I would have come." The road moved on under them. The mountains were close enough now that she could see the detail of the snow on the peaks. Neither of them said anything else for a while, but the silence between them was different from the silence at the beginning of that first drive from town to the ranch. It was full rather than careful, warm rather than polite, and she sat in it with him and felt it settle around her like something that fit. That evening when they arrived back at the ranch, Walt and Silas had kept things in good order and had supper ready, which was both practical and deeply appreciated after 2 days on the road. Walt asked about the trip with cheerful interest, and Silas tried to appear less interested than he was, which was a pattern she had noticed in him. Timothy answered Walt's questions briefly and with humor, and somewhere in the middle of supper, Evelyn found herself thinking that this table, these people, this particular light from the fire in the grate, felt like a thing she had been looking for long enough that she had stopped actively looking, and it had arrived anyway. The letter from Chester Vane arrived at the ranch 2 weeks later. It was polite on the surface and completely clear beneath the politeness. He was aware, he wrote, that there was a registration process underway regarding the water rights on the eastern pasture parcel, and he wanted to propose a meeting at his earliest convenience to discuss what he called an arrangement that might be mutually beneficial. The implication beneath the polite language was that there were ways this situation could resolve itself amicably, and ways that it might become more complicated. Timothy read the letter at the breakfast table and set it down without any particular expression. He passed it to Evelyn and poured himself more coffee and waited. She read it. "He found out faster than I expected," she said. "He has contacts at the land office," Timothy said, "or someone who talks to someone who does." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "He's going to offer me money for the lease. And if you decline, then things get more complicated," Timothy said. "The man has more means than I'd like him to have. He's been building his operation for years, and he's not above using the weight of it to make things difficult for smaller operations." "He could contest the water rights registration," Evelyn said. "He would have to have legal grounds, and I don't think he has them, but a contest delays everything and costs money in attorneys." "Yes," Timothy said, "or he could let it go," she said. "He's a businessman. If the cost of contesting becomes higher than the value of what he's fighting for, he may decide it's not worth it." "That depends on how much he thinks the water rights are worth to him," Timothy said. She looked at the letter again. "Will you meet with him?" "I'll hear what he has to say," Timothy said. "There's no harm in that." The meeting with Chester Vane happened 4 days later, at the Meridian Saloon in town, which was a slightly odd venue for a business meeting, but was apparently the accepted neutral ground for such things in Coldwater Creek. Timothy went alone, which was his preference, and she respected it, and she spent the afternoon working on a revised set of leasing calculations that she thought might be relevant to whatever offer Vane made. Timothy came back in the early evening and found her at the table with her calculations, and sat down across from her, and poured 2 glasses of the whiskey that lived on the kitchen shelf. He offered $1,800 for the eastern pasture lease and the water rights that come with it, Timothy said. Evelyn looked up from her papers. "What did you say?" "I told him I'd think about it," Timothy said, which is the standard answer that doesn't commit to anything. $1,800 is less than half what those water rights will be worth in 10 years if the territory keeps growing, she said. "I know," he said. He pushed a glass toward her. He also made it clear in a very polite way that he has influence with the county assessor, and that property assessments in this area can vary quite a bit depending on what relationship the landowner has with that office. Evelyn looked at him. "He threatened you." "He made an observation," Timothy said, in a polite way. She took the glass, turned it in her hands. "What do you want to do?" He met her eyes. "I want to keep the water rights," he said. "I want to build the ranch properly, which means eventually improving the eastern pasture and using the water access correctly. I want to do what I came here to do and not be pushed off course by a man who thinks owning more land than everyone else gives him the right to set the terms for everyone else." She held his gaze. "Then we fight it," she said. Something in his expression, already settled, became something more, became a look that she felt directly in her chest, solid and warm and real. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. The next 2 months were the fullest Evelyn had lived since she could remember. She wrote to the land attorney in Pueblo and explained the situation with the county assessor threat. And the attorney wrote back with useful information about the legal remedies available and the names of 2 other ranchers in the area who had been on the receiving end of Chester Vane's pressure tactics and might be willing to act in concert. She organized this information methodically and brought it to Timothy piece by piece, and together they built a picture of what Vane had been doing in the territory for years, not criminally, not in ways that were simple to address, but systematically, using his accumulated influence to make things difficult for the smaller operations around him. Walt and Silas were brought into the discussion and contributed their own knowledge of the local landscape, Silas in particular proving to have a detailed grasp of the territorial water law that surprised everyone, including by his expression himself. "I read a lot," Silas said, slightly defensively, when Timothy looked at him with raised eyebrows. "I knew that," Walt said. "I just didn't know you read that." "You can't always tell what a person reads," Evelyn said, and met Timothy's eyes across the table, and they shared a moment of something private and warm that Walt noticed and was politely tactful enough to pretend he hadn't. She also, during this period, wrote to two other ranchers that the attorney had named James Bellamy, who ran a horse operation to the north, and a woman named Clara Fontaine who had built a sheep ranch in the valley east of town, and who, the attorney said, had been fighting with Vane over grazing rights for 2 years. Clara Fontaine arrived at the Running Creek spread on a Tuesday morning in late June in a buggy driven fast, and with an expression that suggested she was accustomed to arriving places and getting immediately to the business of being there. She was perhaps 40, with sharp dark eyes and gray-streaked hair, and the kind of direct manner that Evelyn recognized as the specific efficiency of a woman who has had to work twice as hard as any man in her vicinity to be taken seriously, and has stopped being angry about it and simply uses it as fuel. They liked each other immediately. Clara looked over the documentation Evelyn had assembled, asked several sharp questions, offered 2 observations that improved the legal strategy considerably, and said over coffee that she had been waiting for someone to do this kind of organized resistance to Chester Vane's operation for the better part of 3 years. "The trouble is," Clara said, "the smaller ranchers around here are generally working too hard to have time to organize themselves. He counts on that." "He may have miscounted this time," Evelyn said. Clara looked at her with something that was almost a smile. "You're not from here originally." "Kansas City," Evelyn said, "via 2 years of normal school." "I'm from New Orleans," Clara said, which people find surprising. "Why?" "Because sheep ranching in Colorado Territory is not the obvious next move from New Orleans," Clara said, completely dryly. "My husband thought so too. He stayed in New Orleans." Evelyn looked at her. "I'm sorry. I'm not," Clara said. "I have 400 acres and 500 sheep, and I am answerable to nobody, which is a condition I recommend highly if the alternative is being answerable to the wrong person." James Bellamy came to town separately and met with Timothy at the Meridian, and when Timothy reported back, he said Bellamy was incautious but in, and that the 3 operations combined with the documentation they had assembled made a reasonable case to take to the territorial government office in Denver if Vane continued to use the assessor's office as a weapon. The thing that resolved it in the end was simpler than any of them had planned for. The Pueblo attorney, a methodical man named Franklin Porter who had been practicing territorial law for 15 years, filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office regarding the assessment patterns in the county, citing specific cases across the 3 ranches that showed a clear pattern of assessment increases coinciding with refusals to sell land to Chester Vane. This complaint triggered an inquiry from the territorial government, which sent an inspector from Denver. Chester Vane was not a criminal and he was not stupid, and faced with an official inquiry, he did exactly what Evelyn had calculated a man of his type would do. He stopped. The complaint became part of the territorial record. The assessments were reviewed and corrected. Vane made no further offers for the eastern pasture lease, and when he passed Timothy in the street in Coldwater Creek, He nodded with the careful courtesy of a man who has decided to treat an ongoing situation as a mutual armed truce. The day the letter arrived from the Territorial Land Office confirming that the water rights registration was complete and legally clear, Evelyn was at the kitchen table with the morning coffee, and she read it twice, and then sat quietly for a moment with it in her hands. Timothy came in from the yard, still carrying the morning's work on him, a smear of dust along his forearm, hat pushed back, and saw her sitting there and stopped. "Good news?" he asked. She held up the letter. He crossed the room and took it from her hand and read it, and she watched his face while he did the quiet absorption of it, the way his expression moved through the information and arrived somewhere that was not triumph exactly but was deep, settled satisfaction. He set the letter on the table and looked at her. "You did this," he said. "We did this," she said. "No," he said gently. "You came here and looked at survey maps that had been in a box for 7 years and saw something I had never seen and did something about it. That was you. I had your blessing and your partnership," she said. "Evelyn," he said, and the way he said her name careful and full at the same time, like something he had been keeping carefully and now chose to set down, made her look up at him fully. He was standing on the other side of the table, and his expression had the same quality as the evening on the porch after the water rights conversation, that complete absence of the guard he usually kept around himself. "I wrote that letter before I understood what I was asking for," he said. "And then you came and I understood it, and I have been trying to find the right moment to say something about it for 2 months. She stood up from the table. Her heart was very loud. "You could say something about it now," she said. "I love you," he said. "That is what I have been trying to say. I love you, and this place feels like a life when you're in it, and I want—" He stopped, and the hat came off and turned in his hands. "I know this is not a conventional arrangement. I know that what I am going to say might sound like I am taking advantage of your situation here. I want you to know that if you say no, you still have a position here, and I will still respect you completely. And—" "Timothy," she said. "Yes. Stop talking," she said, "and ask me what you're trying to ask." He looked at her for a moment with those dark, weathered eyes, and then he said, "Will you marry me, Evelyn Hale?" She crossed the kitchen to him in 4 steps and took his face in her hands and kissed him, and he was so surprised by it for just a moment, one brief, entirely human moment of pure astonishment, before his arms came around her, and he kissed her back with the full weight of 2 months of careful, deliberate restraint finally released. When they separated, she stayed close and looked at him and saw that his expression had arrived somewhere entirely new, somewhere she had not seen in it before, and she thought it was the same place she had arrived herself and was glad to find him there. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you, Timothy Collier." He let out a breath that was the particular kind of breath that carries something held too long. "Good," he said, and kissed her again. Walt Drum, who had the specific bad timing of the entirely innocent, walked through the kitchen door approximately 40 seconds later with a question about the fence posts for the north pasture, and found them standing in the middle of the kitchen with their foreheads together, and immediately performed a very impressive pivot back out the door without asking his question. From outside, "Silas, we are going to need a different fence post timeline." From farther outside, "Why?" "I will explain in a moment. Walk this way." Evelyn started laughing first, and Timothy followed, and it was the kind of laughter that comes out of the best possible version of a moment. They were married in the small whitewashed church at the end of Coldwater Creek's Main Street on a Saturday morning in late July 1878, which was a day of improbable beauty. The sky was the deep, saturated blue that only a Colorado July can produce, and the mountains were clear and close-looking, and the air had the particular crisp quality of high altitude on a perfect morning. Ruth Beaumont had apparently appointed herself the organizing force behind the wedding, which meant that the church had been decorated with wildflowers from the surrounding meadows, and that there was a reception planned in the yard of the general store that involved a remarkable quantity of food, and the involvement of approximately half the permanent population of Coldwater Creek. Clara Fontaine came from her sheep ranch in a good dress that was navy blue and looked exactly right on her, and James Bellamy came with his wife, a kind, round-faced woman named Margaret who hugged Evelyn when they were introduced in a way that suggested she was constitutionally warm-hearted, and had decided immediately that Evelyn qualified for it. Walt stood up with Timothy at the front of the church with the specific expression of a man who is genuinely moved by proceedings and is working hard to look as though he is simply being respectful. Silas sat in the front pew looking at the ceiling with an expression that was completely transparent. He was also moved and was finding the ceiling to be a useful focal point. Franklin Porter had driven up from Pueblo specifically for the occasion, which surprised Timothy when he arrived, and which Evelyn found entirely characteristic of a man who turned out, upon acquaintance, to be the kind of solid, reliable person who showed up for things that mattered. The minister was a young man named Reverend Aldous Gray, who had come from Ohio to Coldwater Creek 2 years prior, and had brought with him a cheerful practicality about frontier life and a genuine warmth toward his congregation. He performed the ceremony with care, and with the specific quality of a man who takes the words seriously rather than treating them as a formula. When it came to the vows, Timothy looked at her across the altar with those dark eyes clear and steady, and she thought of the letter, and the porch in the early evening, and the road to Pueblo, and the water rights registration, and the morning in the kitchen when he had finally said the thing he had been trying to say for months, and she felt the sum of all of it move through her like the sound of the creek on a still night, constant and certain, and entirely her own. She said her vows with her voice clear and her heart full, and she saw what it did to his expression when she said them, and it was the most honest thing she had ever witnessed. After the reception, which involved music from a fiddle player named Tom Acker, and dancing in the general store yard until well after the sun went down, and Ruth's considerable cooking, and Walt dancing with an enthusiasm that was more energetic than accurate, and Silas dancing with Clara Fontaine in a way that attracted several interested glances from those assembled. They drove back to the running creek spread in the wagon under a sky full of stars. And the mountains were dark shapes to the west, and the creek was audible before they saw it, and when they arrived home it was theirs. The life they built in the years that followed was built in the way that good things are built slowly, by accumulation, each year adding to what was already there without displacing it. The eastern pasture was improved in the second year, when Timothy rerouted a portion of the creek irrigation to feed it properly, and by the third year, it was the most productive pasture on the ranch. The running creek spread grew from 4,000 acres to nearly 6,000 by 1882, as a neighboring parcel came available, and they bought it together, making the decision at the kitchen table with the ledger between them and their coffee going cold while they talked it through. Evelyn continued managing the accounts. She was too good at it and too interested in it for it to be otherwise, and Timothy had enough sense and enough genuine respect for her capabilities to never suggest it should be any different. She also, in the second year, began keeping accounts for 2 other smaller ranches in the area, whose owners were paying more for outside bookkeeping than they could reasonably afford, which she did at a fair price, and which built into a small practice of her own that she found satisfying in a specific, independent way. Ruth Beaumont became something between a close friend and a complicated aunt, the kind of person who would tell you exactly what she thought about any decision you made with a frankness that could be startling if you were not accustomed to it, but that came from a genuine investment in your well-being that was its own form of love. Clara Fontaine remained a fixture in their lives, and if Evelyn noticed over the winter of 1878 into 1879 that Silas Drum found increasingly frequent reasons to make trips to the Fontaine sheep ranch that were technically explained by practical concerns, she found the matter interesting and kept her observations to herself. By the spring of 1879, Silas and Clara had settled into something that Clara described, when Evelyn finally asked her directly, as an arrangement she found mutually satisfactory, and that Silas described, when Walt asked him directly, as nobody's business. They got married in the fall of 1880, at the Running Creek spread, with the ceremony in the yard under a sky full of autumn color and the mountains behind them. It was Evelyn's turn to stand up with someone, and she stood with Clara while Walt stood with his brother, and Timothy stood near the back with his arms crossed, and an expression of deep contentment that was directed primarily at the general fact of a world in which this was happening. Afterward, Silas told Walt that it was officially nobody's business, but that it was going well, which Walt took as the most expansive statement his brother had made on any personal topic in their combined years of acquaintance. Evelyn and Timothy's first child arrived in the spring of 1880, a boy, whom they named James Daniel Collier, James for James Bellamy, who had become a genuine friend, and Daniel for Timothy's lost partner, whose memory was honored in quiet ways throughout the ranch's life. Timothy held his son for the first time in a way that was entirely still and entirely overwhelmed, and Evelyn watched from the bed with her hair loose and her heart so full that it felt like weather, like something enormous and moving passing through. "Hello," Timothy said to the baby, quietly, as though they had an appointment. Evelyn laughed softly. "He can't answer you yet." "I know," Timothy said. "I'm introducing myself. It's important to start right." James Daniel Collier grew into a sunny, determined small person who inherited his mother's clear gray eyes and his father's deliberate, careful manner, and from an implausibly early age showed a deep interest in the horses that made Walt's expression, every time the boy toddled toward the corral, a mixture of affection and mild alarm. Their second child came in 1882, a girl they named Ruth Evelyn Collier, because there was no question about the Ruth part. Ruth Beaumont received the news of the name with a completely uncharacteristic silence, followed by a very brisk statement that it was a perfectly practical name, and then excused herself from the general store for approximately 5 minutes, which everyone present understood. Ruth Evelyn Collier, from her earliest days, was precisely as opinionated and precisely as warm-hearted as her namesake, which everyone found unsurprising. The territory changed around them year by year, as the West was always changing in that period, new settlements coming in, the railroad pushing farther, more families arriving with the specific combination of hope and grit that the territory demanded and either tempered or broke. Colorado became a state in 1876, the year before Evelyn arrived, and the political and legal landscape was settling into something more structured, which was sometimes good and sometimes complicated and always interesting. There were injustices in that landscape that could not be wished away. The systematic displacement of the Ute people from land they had lived on for generations, a dispossession that proceeded with the indifference of a government that had decided the land was more valuable than the people on it, and that left a mark on the territory that no amount of beautiful sky could cover. Timothy was not unaware of this. He had come from Virginia, which had its own history of land and labor and injustice that he had grown up inside of and carried with him, and he did not make the mistake of thinking that the West was clean of those things simply because it was newer. He could not undo what was being done, but he was not a man who looked away from it and pretended it wasn't happening, and Evelyn respected that in him with a specific, quiet depth. The account that she kept of the ranch's operations during those years was meticulous and comprehensive, and she kept a second account, informal, personal, written in a separate journal, of the life they were building together. Not a diary exactly, but a record of the specific, unrepeatable texture of their days. The morning Timothy found a coyote pup in the barn and spent the better part of an hour trying to figure out what to do about it, while James, aged 2, watched with an expression of total fascination. The evening Clara rode over from the sheep ranch with her hair loose and her eyes bright to tell them that she was expecting, and the supper they had together that went until midnight with the candles burning low. The winter of 1881, when the snow came in October and stayed until March, and the entire community of Coldwater Creek operated in a state of cooperative necessity, that was the best and most practical version of what a community could be. The spring after, when everything came back in such abundance that it felt like the land was making a specific point. She wrote about Timothy the way she had cataloged him in those first weeks, entry by entry, detail by detail, but with the understanding that the ledger was not working toward a total anymore. It was simply the account of a life being lived by two people who had come to it from different directions and found themselves at the same place, which was the best ending any account could have. There was an evening in the summer of 1883 when James was 3 and Ruth was not yet a year old, and the Drum brothers had gone to town, and the ranch was quiet in the late light, and Evelyn and Timothy were on the front porch in the chairs. They had moved there in the first summer because the view from the porch at evening was the best view the property offered. James was asleep inside, and Ruth was in Evelyn's arms, just at the age where she would stay awake past her bedtime if given the opportunity and gaze at the world with the focused, serious consideration of someone conducting a thorough assessment. The mountains were going through their particular evening transformation, the snow on the peaks catching the last direct light while the lower slopes went into shadow, and the creek was audible at the edge of the property, and the horses were moving slowly in the far corral, and the first star was appearing over the eastern plains. Timothy reached over and took her hand, which was the gesture he had settled into over the years, not dramatic, not declarative, simply a hand reaching for her hand because it was the natural position of things. She turned her palm up and folded her fingers around his. Ruth looked at their joined hands with the focused expression of a person doing the math on something. "She's going to be very perceptive," Timothy said. "She already is," Evelyn said. "Gets it from her mother," he said. "She has your patience." "That is not a virtue I was aware I possessed until recently," he said. "You've always had it," she said. "You were patient with the ranch when it was barely workable. You were patient with Chester Vane when you would have been entitled to be angry. You were patient with me." He looked at her. "I don't remember being patient with you." "You were very patient," she said. "You let me come to everything at my own speed." "That wasn't patience," he said. "That was the understanding that rushing you would have been a catastrophic error." She laughed, and Ruth looked at her with interest. "You were right about that," Evelyn said. "I'm occasionally right about things," he said, with the particular modest gravity that meant he was pleased with himself. "Don't let it become a habit," she said. "I'll try to hold it to 3 or 4 times a year," he said. The star was out fully now, the first one, and the mountains were going dark, and Ruth Evelyn Collier was falling asleep in her mother's arms with the specific unhurried certainty of a person who has decided that the world will still be there after a rest. The creek moved in the east. The horses were still. Evelyn looked at the mountains, and then at the man beside her, who was looking at the same mountains with an expression that she had been reading for 5 years and still found worth reading. And she thought about a letter that had been written before its author knew what he was saying, and a woman who had known exactly what she was answering when she wrote back, and a road that had gone from Kansas City to a porch in Colorado Territory in the best way such roads could go, not straight, not easy, but with good views along the way and an arrival that made every mile of it worth it. "Timothy," she said. He looked at her. The evening was full around them, the stars coming in over the plains, the light entirely gone from the mountains now, and the peaks silver-white in the early darkness. "Thank you for the letter," she said. He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, steady eyes that had the mountains in them and everything else they had been through. And then he brought their joined hands up and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was so quiet and so complete that she felt it in every part of herself. "Thank you for answering it," he said. They sat there until Ruth was fully asleep, and the stars had fully arrived, and the night was settled deep over the Colorado Territory, and neither of them moved to go inside, because there was nowhere else either of them needed to be. In the years that continued after that summer evening, the Running Creek spread grew steadily into exactly what Timothy had imagined when he first arrived in the territory with Daniel Marsh, and the two of them had stood on the land and looked at what it could be. The cattle operation expanded. Evelyn's bookkeeping practice became a small but genuine business that she ran from the ranch, and occasionally from a desk she rented by the day at the post office in Coldwater Creek. James grew from a sunny toddler into a serious, curious boy who loved horses and books in approximately equal measure. Ruth grew from a focused infant into a small, definite person who had opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express them, by an age that regularly surprised the adults around her. Ruth Beaumont, the original Ruth, the one the girl was named for, came to the ranch for Sunday dinners with a frequency that started as occasional and became simply understood. She had sold the general store in 1882 to a young couple from Missouri who were grateful for the inventory system she handed over, and she had retired into a house on the main street of Coldwater Creek that was always warm and always had coffee on, and she had inserted herself into the lives of the Collier family with the specific authority of someone who has decided that grandmotherly status is available on an informal basis to those who earn it, whether or not they have biological claim to it. James called her Aunt Ruth, which she said was close enough. Clara and Silas moved their combined operation, sheep and cattle, an arrangement that most of the county found impractical and that consistently proved profitable, to a larger property in 1884, a few miles further east, and built a house there that Clara designed herself with a practicality and a specific aesthetic clarity that said a great deal about who she was. Their daughter was born in 1881 and their son in 1883, and the two families moved through the seasons of those years with the easy intimacy of people who have been through something real together and come out on the same side of it. Walt Drum married a woman named Agnes who came to Coldwater Creek in 1881 with a schoolteacher's certificate and took the position at the small school at the edge of town that had been operating without a qualified teacher for 2 years. Walt had gone to introduce himself on behalf of the ranching community and had come back to the ranch that evening with a slightly dazed expression that Evelyn had looked at across the supper table and immediately understood. Agnes was a calm, extremely clear-eyed woman who looked at Walt with the specific patience of someone who has decided a thing is worth waiting for, and they were married in the spring of 1882 and bought their own small property 2 miles from the Running Creek spread, which kept Walt close enough for the work arrangement to continue and gave everyone the privacy appropriate to people with their own lives to live. The Running Creek spread held all of it, the seasons and the work and the small daily accumulation of years that is what a life is actually made of. The books on the shelf grew because Evelyn kept adding to them, and eventually a second shelf was required, which Timothy built on a winter Sunday with James watching from a safe distance and making observations about the process that were more useful than Timothy let on. The kitchen table had been replaced once because the original developed a wobble that no amount of attention could cure, and the new table was longer, better suited to the Sunday dinners that sometimes had 8 or 9 people around them. Timothy had a gray hair or two at his temples by 1884 that Evelyn found herself looking at with a feeling that was purely tender, and she had a scar along her left palm from a mishap with the fence wire in the spring of 1881 that he had cleaned and bandaged with such careful, focused attention that she had watched his hands the whole time and felt nothing except the fact of being cared for. They argued occasionally, as people do who live close together and think seriously about things. Once, memorably, about the relative merits of increasing the cattle herd versus diversifying into a smaller sheep operation as their neighbors had done. A conversation that went several rounds over 3 days before resolving itself with a compromise that turned out to be correct. Once about whether James should be sent to a school in Denver for a year at the age of 7, which Evelyn argued for and Timothy was more reluctant about, and which they resolved when Agnes told them firmly that James could learn what he needed to learn right here and she would see to it personally, which settled the question. But disagreement was a small whether in the larger climate of their life, and neither of them was inclined to treat it as anything more than what it was. Two people who thought carefully about things, sometimes thinking about the same things differently, which was not a problem, but was simply the truth of what it meant to share a life with another full person. In the autumn of 1885, on the occasion of their 7th anniversary, celebrated with a dinner that Ruth Beaumont came to and insisted on cooking half of, and Clara and Silas brought wine from a bottle that had been stored for this specific occasion, Timothy gave Evelyn a journal. It was leather-bound, good quality, with her name stamped on the front in small gilt letters, E. Collier. Inside the front cover he had written, in that clear, deliberate hand that she had first read in the letter from a man she had never met, for the account of the years ahead, which I intend to make worth recording. She read it at the table with everyone around her and said nothing for a moment, and then looked up at him across the table where he was watching her with the expression she had come to know best, that steady, warm, entirely present look that was the look of a man who understood what he had and was grateful for it every day. "You always write better than you think you do," she said. "I have a good subject," he said. Walt made a sound that was something between moved and embarrassed. Agnes patted his hand. Clara looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone finding it unexpectedly interesting, which was apparently a trait she and Silas had exchanged at some point in the way couples exchange habits. Ruth Beaumont looked extremely satisfied with the general state of everything, which was her characteristic expression at its most intense. James, who was 5 and had been allowed to stay up late on the grounds that it was a special occasion, looked around at the adults with the focused assessment of a child, who understands that something important is happening but has not yet acquired the language for it, and then looked at his father and his mother, and apparently arrived at a satisfactory conclusion, because he went back to the food on his plate with the air of someone who has determined that all is as it should be. Ruth, small Ruth, the opinionated one, barely 3 years old and not in the least ready for sleep regardless of what anyone thought about it, was sitting in Evelyn's lap and had reached up and grabbed the new journal with both hands and was investigating it with the thoroughness of someone who has decided that objects in the vicinity require assessment. Evelyn let her hold it, and Timothy watched them both, and the candlelight moved over everything, and the creek was running in the darkness outside, and the mountains were out there in the night where they had always been, and the life that had been built here, entry by entry, year by year, from a letter written faster than its author was thinking, was full and warm and real. She would write in that journal for years. She wrote about the harvests and the hard winters and the good springs. She wrote about the children growing and changing, and becoming themselves with the specific velocity that children have. She wrote about Ruth Beaumont's 82nd birthday celebration in the summer of 1890, which was held in the church yard and attended by most of Coldwater Creek, and about how the old woman accepted the occasion with the gruff satisfaction of someone who has decided that if the world insists on making a fuss, the least she can do is allow it. She wrote about James at 12, handling the horses with a quiet authority that made Timothy look at her across the corral with an expression of pure, helpless pride. She wrote about Ruth at 10, arguing a point at the Sunday dinner table with such precision that Clara, who was not easily outmaneuvered, sat back and said with complete sincerity that the girl was going to either be a lawyer or run the territory, and either way everyone else had better pay attention. She wrote about Timothy as she had always recorded him carefully, with detail, because the detail was the thing, the specific and unrepeatable particulars of a person that add up to who they actually are. The way he came in from the cold in the mornings and held his hands to the fire and talked to the flames sometimes, not quite consciously, in a low murmur that she had given up trying to hear, because it was not meant for her, but that she loved knowing was there. The way he read by the lamp in the evenings and occasionally said something to the book in the tone of a man having an argument with someone who was not there to respond. The way he looked at the mountains on the mornings when something in the light was particularly extraordinary, which happened more often than you would think in Colorado, and the expression on his face during those moments was the same expression he had worn on the front porch when he said "I love you" for the first time, every guard gone, nothing between him and what he was looking at. She wrote about those mornings. She wrote about the evenings on the porch and the way the stars came out over the plains. She wrote about the supper table full of people they loved, and about the quiet nights when it was just the two of them in the sitting room with the fire low and the books open. She wrote about the letter, often, over the years, in the way that you return to the origin point of a thing because it helps you understand where you are. He had written the letter before he knew what he was asking. That was the truth of it, stated plainly in his own words to a woman he hadn't met yet. He had been reaching toward something in the language available to him without fully understanding what he was reaching for, and she had read between what he'd written and understood it anyway, and she had come. And by the time she arrived, he had figured it out. And what he had figured out was that he had been building a life that needed her in it, and she had been looking for a life that needed her in it, and neither of them had known how to say the true thing until they were close enough to it to say it. That was the story. That was what she wrote in the journal, year by year, in the handwriting that had organized 3 years of ledger books and the water rights registration, and the accounts of 2 other ranches and 1,000 other practical things. Because she was a woman who organized the world by writing it down, and what she was writing down now was the truest account she had ever kept. On a morning in the early spring of 1887, when the snow was just coming off the mountains, and the creek was running high and loud, and the air had that particular quality that meant winter was finally, genuinely done, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the journal and wrote the date, and then sat for a moment looking out the window at the yard, where Timothy was talking to Walt about the spring fence checking, their breath visible in the cold air, both of them looking out across the land with the easy, familiar attention of men who know the place they're standing as well as they know anything. She watched him for a while, his profile, his hands moving as he spoke, the way he turned his head at something Walt said and smiled fully, genuinely, the way she had seen him do more often in the years they'd been together than in all the careful, guarded months before he'd finally found the words. Then she wrote. He sent the letter before he knew what he was asking. By the time I arrived, he had figured it out. I am glad every day that I came to find out what it was. She closed the journal and got up to put the coffee on, because he would be in from the cold soon, and she knew what he needed when he came in from the cold. And knowing what someone needed was itself a kind of love, the daily kind, the kind that is not dramatic but is the structure everything else is built on. The door opened and he came in with the cold on him, and she handed him the coffee without turning from the stove, and he said thank you in the low, warm voice that she would have recognized at any distance, in any weather, across any amount of time, and she heard him settle into the chair at the table behind her, the particular sound of a particular person settling into a particular chair, and she thought, this is the account. This is all of it. This is the thing that was worth coming for. And the creek ran outside and the mountains stood in the clear morning light, and the life that had been built here, entry by entry, was exactly what it was and exactly enough and entirely, completely theirs.